Hello, 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 everybody. Welcome to number two screencast since we've been out on quarantine. So I received an email and about this PowerPoint, and I want to apologize. I guess I'm acclimating to this distant learning thing myself. So I thought I had posted a PowerPoint just on progressive era foreign policy, and I uploaded the wrong PowerPoint. So rather than delete and upload another PowerPoint, I'm just going to keep that one up. And I thought I'd add a little screencast to explain a little bit about progressive foreign policy. So as you know, if you've went through this screencast already, excuse me, you see that there's a big long presentation about World War One, and it's not my intent to go into World War One with you right now. We're going to be doing that next week. So let me just walk you through a little bit of progressive foreign policy, and we'll move on from there. So don't worry. I hope that didn't confuse anybody. All right. So a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt. I'm going to try to go fairly quickly here, and since I don't think I need a lot of time for this presentation, I'll use this time to kind of explain why for future presentations. So I'm going to be keeping these presentations to about 15 minutes, and that's for two reasons. One reason is that the app that I'm using to make these screencasts limit me to 15-minute presentations. And two, I think 15 minutes is a good number, right? You guys probably don't want to listen to me for much longer than that. So with that in mind, this presentation won't be anywhere near that. But with that in mind, I do want to give you just a brief overview of progressive foreign policy. So when we talk about the progressive era is really important. And it does make me wonder as we get ready for this AP exam if we might see a question on the progressive era. When we look at the progressive era, it's such an interesting period because when we look at the period before the progressive era and then we look at the period after the progressive era, we can really see that the progressive era is a turning point in almost every way that you can think of. It's a turning point in terms of the role of the federal government on domestic affairs. It's a turning point in terms of the role the government's playing in foreign policy. And post-progressive era, we see things like the New Deal, and we see things like containment and America's foreign policy during the Cold War. And really, in a lot of ways, the progressive era provides a bridge to more of what we think of as a modern America. So with that in mind, speaking of, look at Teddy Roosevelt here. This is just a trivia question here. Teddy Roosevelt actually was the youngest president in American history. And sometimes people think it's John F. Kennedy, and this is just a nerdy little thing. John F. Kennedy was the youngest elected president in American history, but Teddy Roosevelt became president by way of assassination when William McKinley was assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt, so many great stories about Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a person who was constantly looking to do something. And if you had a chance to watch that video that I posted, his personality, second only to maybe Andrew Jackson, his personality dominates his presidency. So it's not so much his political philosophy or his view on the Constitution or the government. It really is who he is dominates his presidency. And I love this picture just because it kind of shows who he is. Like, he's this man of action. And of course, anyone who knows anything about Teddy Roosevelt knows the numerous stories about him. So with that in mind, let's dive into it. Now, this is the part that I would talk about quite a bit in class, but we're going to move along. If you're a little bored and you're looking for something incredibly inspirational, I would encourage you to Google A Strenuous Life by Teddy Roosevelt and read it. It's just, great. Teddy Roosevelt, hunter, conservationist, activist, but in the realm of foreign policy. So why do I spend a little time talking about a personality? Because Teddy Roosevelt had this active personality. He wanted to get involved. He wanted to do things. If you think about Washington's farewell address, the idea that the United States was going to avoid European entanglements and the United States was going to have a more isolationist policy, Teddy Roosevelt in many ways is going to change that with his Roosevelt corollary. When we talk about the Roosevelt corollary, it's important to understand what came before. Contextualization, right? We always talk about contextualization. And what came before the Roosevelt corollary, a little sip of coffee, just like in class, right? What came before the Roosevelt corollary was the Monroe Doctrine. And And the Roosevelt corollary is literally an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. So think about this. One way that I teach this is think about this like Legos. So the Roosevelt corollary is the bottom. I'm sorry, the Monroe Doctrine is the bottom Lego. The Roosevelt corollary goes right on top of the Monroe Doctrine. So it's really a part of the Monroe Doctrine, and it's got the nickname the Big Stick Policy. So with that in mind, the Roosevelt corollary, how is it part of the Monroe Doctrine? The Monroe Doctrine said that the United States will not tolerate European interference in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere is our side of the world, and it's our backyard, and we do not want European nations to colonize Western Hemispheric nations because that's a threat to our national security. So the United States will not tolerate European colonization or European interference in the Western Hemisphere. That's the that's the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt corollary, the way that I always teach this, is that it's really a simple thing to understand. Just think of the Monroe Doctrine and add 2 words, or all right, let's say 3 words, but we can. So we will not tolerate European interference in the Western Hemisphere, but we can. So it's an expansion of American power. And of course, this makes sense to you, right? Following the Spanish-American War, of course, Teddy Roosevelt's personal role in Cuba and the Battle of San Juan Hill. But there's a few specific examples, and I think the best and the first is Venezuela. So Venezuela owed England money. England wanted their money. England threatened to take over Venezuelan harbors to impose taxes and duties to collect their money. And that would have been a clear violation of the Monroe Doctrine. So what Teddy Roosevelt says is, you can't do that, but we can. And we send in the military and we send in our Navy, what Teddy Roosevelt referred to as the Great White Fleet, a very Rudyard Kipling-esque name for our Navy, right? So we send in the Navy and we take over the harbors and we impose taxes and duties and we pay England their money. And the United States, this is a big departure from America's isolationist policy in the past. The United States is getting actively involved. And as we move forward, and I believe the College Board screencast from a couple of days ago talked about this a little bit when it talked about the Truman Doctrine and the Eisenhower Doctrine. And I would even go further and talk about the Bush Doctrine, that as we move forward and you think about American foreign policy, it really, the Lego metaphor, I think, is a good one because it's really building upon each subsequent foreign policy. So the Monroe Doctrine says you can't do it. The Roosevelt corollary says, but we can. And then as we move forward in history, things like the Truman Doctrine expands America's influence into Europe, specifically with the goal of stopping the spread of communism. And then even more recently, the Bush Doctrine expands the United States influence in specifically the Middle East with an attempt to stop communism. So thinking of the Lego metaphor is a good way of thinking of American foreign policy. Without going into any detail about Haiti or Panama, the United States continues this policy in many Latin American nations. These cartoons will talk about the AP exam, pie chart of success. I'm always telling you guys that these cartoons come up a lot. And if you understand your history, this cartoon, means a little bit more than if you were just to look at it as someone who didn't know the backstory. So you see that this battleship debt collector, it says Teddy Roosevelt has the big stick. He's walking through the Caribbean Sea. And think about collecting debt. There's this policeman or this police officer metaphor. And the big stick here is, of course, a police baton. And of course, whenever we look at these historical documents, oftentimes, they're pretty insensitive by our modern standards. But this is a great cartoon to illustrate what Teddy Roosevelt believed in. All right. So you have PowerPoint, so I'm not going to click this for you, but you click this link. It says we invade Latin America a lot. So think about all these years where we're following an isolationist policy, and then after the Teddy Roosevelt corollary, after the big stick policy or doctrine, the United States invades Latin America over and over and over again, which leads us to Teddy Roosevelt's other achievements. Teddy Roosevelt wins the Nobel Peace Prize for brokering a peace between Russia and Japan. I'm going to, because of time, I'm going to let you use your book to look these up. Teddy Roosevelt, a very active president. Teddy Roosevelt retires from office, and his predecessor, Big William Howard Taft, comes into play. And I'm a big fan of William Howard Taft, and we'll talk more about him on Monday, I'm sure. Taft's policy is known as dollar diplomacy, and in a lot of ways, Taft's policy is more influential in the modern world than Teddy Roosevelt. So essentially, and I've got one eye towards the clock, I have about 5 minutes left, better quick, but William Howard Taft believed that the United States could influence other countries, not necessarily using our military or a big stick, but using money. So if we invest in these countries, if we invest in railroads in China, for example, or businesses in Central America, these businesses will later be called banana republics, that the United States now will have an economic interest in those countries. And as such, the United States will have influence over the government. These governments are sometimes called banana republics. And I always think it's kind of funny because when I think of banana republic, I think about the clothing store. And, when I think of what it actually was, it has nothing to do with that at all. I'd love to know why the makers of that store thought that would be an appropriate name for their place of business. But that's just a side note. So Teddy Roosevelt, always wanting to be in the arena, famously decides to run for the presidency against his former someone he supported, Taft, both Republicans. They split the vote, and Woodrow Wilson wins. And Woodrow Wilson is we might Woodrow Wilson as more of a liberal Democrat. There's Teddy Roosevelt. That is not photoshopped, by the way. That's Teddy Roosevelt riding a moose across a river. There's too many stories to tell. So super quick, look who comes out of the grave. And I think I have that cartoon right here, right? William Jennings Bryan ran for the presidency 3 times, the populist leader, Cross of Gold speech. He comes out of nowhere and is now Secretary of State to Woodrow Wilson. And remember, William Jennings Bryan was an anti-imperialist, a much more liberal, progressive foreign policy. So Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy is moral diplomacy. In other words, he said that the United States has been acting as bully, and he makes plans to give Puerto Rico increased rights. He makes plans to give the Philippines independence. He says we'll start paying to use the Panama Canal. So it's much more progressive, more liberal foreign policy. But things have been changed forever in terms of American foreign policy, because even Woodrow Wilson sends troops to Mexico. We invade Mexico looking for the bandito Pancho Villa, and we invade and bomb Nicaragua and Haiti. So there's a brief explanation of progressive foreign policy. If this PowerPoint confused you, I'm so sorry. I did not mean to include the World War I into this. We will talk more about this next week. I hope this screencast helped, and I'm hoping to do a little Kahoot with you guys next week to review progressive domestic and progressive foreign policy, because like I said, it's a pretty important topic. I hope everyone's well. Talk to you soon.